Rain streaked down the BMW's windshield as Alexander Reed watched his world collapse one spoonful at a time. Inside Ruby's Corner Café, a stranger was doing what 18 months of specialists couldn't, reaching his 7-year-old daughter. The woman knelt beside a wheelchair-bound boy, her auburn hair catching amber light as she offered soup with ritual patience. Alexander's knuckles pressed white against the steering wheel. 2 years of silence from Isabella. 2 years of empty laughter, hollow hope, expensive failures. But something flickered behind her daughter's eyes as she pressed her palm against the fogged window. Recognition, curiosity, life. The waitress glanced up, met Alexander's desperate stare through storm-washed glass, and smiled the kind of smile that reaches broken places. The man who built empires from code and steel had no idea this gentle stranger feeding children in a forgotten cafe held the key to everything he'd lost, and the power to destroy everything he thought he knew. The medical files scattered across Alexander's home office told the same story in different handwriting. Selective mutism, psychological trauma, treatment-resistant behavioral patterns. 18 specialists had tried to reach Isabella since the accident, each one armed with degrees from prestigious universities and treatment protocols worth more than most people's annual salaries. Dr. Patterson had been the latest disappointment, his clinical voice delivering hope and crushing it in the same breath. Alexander pushed away from his desk, the weight of failure pressing against his chest like a physical thing. Through the window, Seattle's skyline pierced the afternoon clouds, 47 floors below his penthouse office. He'd built Reed Technologies from nothing, turning late-night coding sessions into a software empire that revolutionized data security for half the Fortune 500 companies in America. But success meant nothing when your 7-year-old daughter hadn't spoken since watching her mother die in twisted metal and broken glass. Isabella sat in the corner of his office now, surrounded by expensive toys that might as well have been museum pieces for all the attention she paid them. Her small fingers traced patterns on the leather chair, the same repetitive motion she'd performed thousands of times since the accident. Alexander's assistant had mentioned the cafe 3 days ago, her voice dropping to whisper levels. The woman there had a reputation. Children who couldn't be reached by conventional methods somehow found their voices in her presence. Alexander had dismissed it as desperate parent mythology, the kind of magical thinking that flourished in the spaces where medicine failed. Now he sat outside Ruby's Corner Café like a surveillance operative, watching a woman who looked nothing like the miracle worker his imagination had conjured. She moved between tables with practiced efficiency, but there was something different about her interactions with certain customers. The elderly man in the corner booth received extra attention, his trembling hands guided gently to his coffee cup. A teenage girl with obvious anxiety got a chocolate chip cookie shaped like a star, delivered with a knowing smile that seemed to say everything would be okay. And the children. There were always children here, Alexander had noticed during his 3 days of observation, received treatment that bordered on reverent. This woman didn't just serve food. She fed souls. Isabella's breathing had changed, becoming shallow and rapid in the way that usually preceded one of her episodes. But instead of the panic attacks that typically followed, she seemed mesmerized by the scene outside. Her small hand pressed against the car window, fingers spread wide like she was trying to touch something just beyond reach. Alexander followed her gaze and saw the auburn-haired woman approaching a table where a boy sat alone, his wheelchair positioned carefully beside the booth. The woman knelt to bring herself level with the child's eyes, speaking words Alexander couldn't hear, but whose effects were immediately visible. The boy's rigid posture relaxed. His hands stopped their anxious fluttering. When the woman offered him a spoon filled with what looked like chicken soup, he opened his mouth without resistance. "She remembers," Alexander whispered, more to himself than to Isabella. But his daughter turned at the sound of his voice, her eyes meeting his for the first time in weeks. The contact lasted only seconds before she looked away, but something had passed between them. Recognition, hope, the dangerous possibility that healing might be more than just expensive therapy sessions and pharmaceutical interventions. Alexander made his decision with the same instinct that had guided him through hostile corporate takeovers and million-dollar product launches. Sometimes you had to trust what you couldn't quantify. Sometimes you had to bet everything on variables that couldn't be measured or controlled. The cafe's bell chimed as Alexander pushed through the front door, Isabella's hand tucked securely in his. The interior smelled like comfort food and fresh possibilities. Cinnamon rolls, coffee beans, something indefinable that reminded him of childhood visits to his grandmother's kitchen. Ruby Williams looked up from wiping down tables, her eyes moving from Alexander to Isabella, with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to reading situations instantly. She didn't seem surprised to see them, as if she'd been expecting their arrival since the moment Alexander had started his surveillance 3 days ago. Her smile was warm, but not overwhelming, careful not to spook a child who'd learned to fear new experiences and unfamiliar faces. "You must be Isabella," Ruby said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of working with fragile things. She approached slowly, giving Isabella plenty of space to retreat if necessary. "I've been watching you through the window, and I think you might be hungry. Would you like to try my famous heart-shaped pancakes?" Isabella's grip on Alexander's hand tightened, but she didn't pull away or hide behind his leg. This was progress. In 18 months of therapy sessions, Isabella had never voluntarily engaged with a new adult. Ruby seemed to understand the significance of Isabella's stillness, the way she held her ground instead of fleeing. "We'll start with something simple," Ruby continued, producing a small ceramic bowl decorated with tiny painted hearts. "This is my special soup. It tastes like sunshine and has magical properties for helping people find their voices." Alexander wanted to object to the fairy tale language, to explain that Isabella's condition required serious medical intervention rather than whimsical stories about magical soup. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way Isabella's eyes tracked Ruby's movements, or the subtle relaxation in his daughter's shoulders, or simply the desperate father's intuition that conventional wisdom had already failed them spectacular. Ruby guided them to a table by the window, the same spot where Alexander had watched her feed the wheelchair-bound boy yesterday. The position offered Isabella a clear view of the parking lot and Alexander's BMW, an escape route visible at all times, reducing the anxiety that came with feeling trapped in unfamiliar environments. Ruby disappeared into the kitchen, returning with a tray that looked like it belonged in a children's picture book. The soup bowl sat in the center, surrounded by crackers cut into star shapes, a cup of milk with a striped straw, and napkins folded to look like origami flowers. She'd even included a small spoon with a wooden handle painted to look like a butterfly. Isabella stared at the display with the intensity she usually reserved for her repetitive tracing patterns. Slowly, carefully, she reached for the butterfly spoon and dipped it into the bowl, The first taste was tentative, barely a sip. The second was larger. By the fourth spoonful, Isabella was eating with something approaching enthusiasm. Alexander felt tears burning behind his eyes. When was the last time he'd seen his daughter show interest in food? When was the last time she'd made choices about what to eat or how to eat it? "She has beautiful eyes," Ruby said quietly, settling into the chair across from Alexander, while keeping her attention partially focused on Isabella. Children who've experienced profound loss often develop extraordinary awareness. They see things adults miss because they've learned that the world can change in an instant. Her words carried weight beyond casual observation, the kind of insight that came from professional training or personal experience with trauma. Alexander studied Ruby's face, looking for clues about her background. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of natural beauty that didn't rely on expensive cosmetics or designer clothing. But her eyes held depth that spoke of hard-won wisdom, the look of someone who'd seen enough pain to recognize it in others. "How long have you owned this place?" Alexander asked, genuinely curious about the woman who'd accomplished in 10 minutes what teams of specialists hadn't managed in 2 years. Ruby's smile flickered, just slightly, like she was deciding how much truth to share. 2 years, she had finally. "I opened it after—" She paused, glancing at Isabella, who was now methodically eating crackers with the same focused attention she usually gave to her tracing patterns. "After I needed a change from my previous work. Sometimes life requires us to start over completely." The answer felt incomplete, carefully edited to avoid specifics. Alexander recognized the technique from business negotiations, sharing just enough information to seem forthcoming while revealing nothing substantial. Isabella finished her soup and looked up at Ruby with expectation. It was such a normal childhood behavior that Alexander felt disoriented, as if he'd stepped into an alternate reality where his daughter had never stopped being a regular 7-year-old who got hungry and looked to adults for what came next. Ruby seemed to understand the unspoken question. "Would you like to help me feed Mr. Peterson?" she asked, nodding toward an elderly man sitting alone in a corner booth. "He gets lonely eating by himself, and I think he'd enjoy some company." Isabella considered this proposition with the seriousness she brought to all decisions. Then, in a gesture that stopped Alexander's breathing entirely, she nodded and stood up from her chair. Ruby led Isabella to Mr. Peterson's table, carrying another ceramic bowl filled with what looked like beef stew. The elderly man's face lit up when he saw them approaching, his weathered hands clapping together with genuine delight. "Well, hello there, young lady," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who'd spent decades around children. "Are you going to help me with my lunch today?" Isabella nodded gravely and accepted the spoon Ruby offered her. What followed was something Alexander had never expected to witness, his daughter feeding a stranger with the same patient care Ruby had shown the wheelchair-bound boy yesterday. Each spoonful was offered carefully, with attention to Mr. Peterson's pace and preferences. When he smiled and told her the stew was delicious, Isabella almost smiled back. Alexander watched this interaction with growing amazement and confusion. Where had Isabella learned such nurturing behavior? How did she know instinctively how to care for someone else when she'd barely been able to care for herself since the accident? Ruby stood nearby, supervising but not interfering, allowing Isabella to develop her own rhythm and relationship with Mr. Peterson. There was something professional about Ruby's approach, a quality that suggested training beyond restaurant management or casual childcare experience. She observed Isabella with the focused attention of someone taking mental notes, assessing progress and planning next steps. This wasn't random kindness. This was structured intervention disguised as organic social interaction. When Mr. Peterson finished his stew, Isabella carefully wiped his mouth with a napkin and carried his empty bowl back to the kitchen. She moved through the cafe like she belonged there, navigating between tables and other customers with confidence Alexander hadn't seen from her in months. Ruby followed at a discreet distance, ready to intervene if necessary, but clearly pleased with Isabella's independence. They disappeared into the kitchen together, leaving Alexander alone with questions that multiplied faster than he could process them. Who was Ruby Williams? What kind of training did she have? Why did his daughter respond to her when highly credentialed professionals had failed? And why did he feel like he was watching his child return from a place so distant he'd feared she might never find her way back? Ruby and Isabella emerged from the kitchen 20 minutes later, both carrying plates of chocolate chip cookies shaped like hearts. They distributed the treats to other customers with ceremonial importance, Isabella presenting each cookie like a gift rather than simply delivering food. The transformation was remarkable. The withdrawn, silent child who'd entered the cafe an hour ago had become engaged, purposeful, almost social. She still didn't speak, but her body language had changed completely. Her shoulders were back, her movements deliberate rather than hesitant. She made eye contact with customers when she handed them cookies, even managing small nods when they thanked her. This was the daughter Alexander remembered from before the accident. Confident, caring, naturally drawn to helping others. "She's going to be fine," Ruby said, returning to Alexander's table, while Isabella continued her cookie distribution duties. "It might take time, and there will probably be setbacks, but the foundation is still there." The trauma didn't destroy her natural empathy or her desire to connect with others. It just buried those qualities under protective layers of silence and withdrawal. Alexander stared at Ruby with growing suspicion and hope. These weren't the observations of a casual cafe owner. This was professional assessment delivered with clinical precision. "You sound like you know something about childhood trauma," he said carefully, testing to see how she'd respond to direct questioning about her qualifications. Ruby's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "I've seen enough children struggling with loss to recognize the patterns," she said, which was truth without being complete truth. Isabella is lucky to have a father who's willing to try different approaches. Many parents give up when conventional treatments don't work immediately. The deflection was skillful but obvious. Ruby Williams was hiding something significant about her background, something that might explain her extraordinary ability to reach damaged children. Alexander made a mental note to research her more thoroughly. In his business world, people who possessed unusual skills but avoided discussing their credentials usually had compelling reasons for their secrecy. Isabella returned to their table, climbing into her chair with satisfaction visible on her face. For the first time since the accident, she looked proud of herself, pleased with her own accomplishments. She'd successfully fed 2 people and distributed cookies to an entire cafe full of strangers. In the world of childhood development, these were massive achievements for a child who'd been essentially catatonic for 2 years. Alexander felt gratitude so overwhelming it threatened to bring him to tears in public. Whatever Ruby's secrets, whatever her real qualifications or hidden motivations, she'd given him something precious beyond measure, hope that his daughter could heal. "Can we come back tomorrow?" Alexander asked, surprising himself with the question. He'd intended to observe, to evaluate, to maintain some semblance of control over Isabella's treatment. Instead, he found himself surrendering to the possibility that healing might require trust rather than oversight, faith rather than analysis. Ruby looked at Isabella, who nodded enthusiastically in response to Alexander's question. "Tomorrow we're making vegetable soup?" Ruby said. "Isabella can help me choose which vegetables to include, and Mr. Peterson specifically requested her assistance with his lunch again." Isabella beamed at this information, the first genuine expression of joy Alexander had seen from her since before Margaret's death. They left the cafe with plans to return the following day, Isabella chattering silently to herself in the back seat, while Alexander processed what he'd witnessed. His daughter had engaged socially, shown empathy, demonstrated motor skills, and displayed emotional regulation that had been absent for 2 years, all in the span of 90 minutes with a woman whose qualifications remained mysterious, but whose results were undeniable. Alexander's corporate instincts demanded background checks, credential verification, detailed analysis of Ruby's methods and training. But his paternal instincts whispered something different, that some forms of healing couldn't be quantified or controlled, that sometimes the most profound transformations happened when you stopped trying to manage them. The next morning, Isabella woke before her alarm clock for the first time since the accident. She stood by her bedroom window, looking towards the direction of Ruby's Café, with anticipation that reminded Alexander painfully of how she used to wait for Margaret to come home from work. The comparison was both heartbreaking and hopeful. Heartbreaking because it emphasized everything they'd lost. Hopeful because it suggested Isabella's capacity for attachment and excitement hadn't been permanently damaged. She ate breakfast without prompting, dressed herself with minimal assistance, and waited by the front door 15 minutes before their scheduled departure time. The cafe was busier than it had been the previous day, filled with what appeared to be regular customers who greeted Ruby by name and settled into preferred tables with familiar routine. Alexander noticed details he'd missed before, the way certain customers received modified service, accommodations for physical limitations or special dietary needs. An elderly woman with arthritis got her coffee cup filled only halfway to prevent spills. A man with obvious cognitive difficulties was guided gently to his usual corner booth and served the same meal he apparently ordered every day. A teenage girl with what looked like an eating disorder received a small portion of soup and encouraging smiles, but no pressure to finish everything on her plate. Ruby wasn't just running a restaurant. She was providing specialized care for a population of customers with various needs and vulnerabilities. The realization hit Alexander with unexpected force. This was why Isabella had responded so positively yesterday. Ruby's Café wasn't a typical commercial establishment. It was essentially an informal therapy center disguised as a neighborhood restaurant, a place where people with different kinds of damage could find nourishment and acceptance without the clinical atmosphere that often intimidated those who most needed help. Isabella had instinctively recognized this environment as safe, a place where her own difficulties wouldn't make her unusual or unwelcome. Isabella went directly to Mr. Peterson's table, as if she'd been coming here for months rather than days. The elderly man welcomed her with obvious delight, already anticipating their shared lunch ritual. Ruby provided another ceramic bowl, this one filled with chicken and dumplings that smelled like comfort itself. Isabella fed Mr. Peterson with growing confidence, their interaction developing its own rhythm and communication style that transcended words. Watching them together, Alexander began to understand something important about healing. It wasn't always about returning to previous states of functioning. Sometimes it was about finding new ways to connect and contribute that worked within current limitations and capacities. She has natural caregiving instincts, Ruby observed, joining Alexander at his observation post. Children who experience loss early often develop extraordinary empathy. They understand suffering in ways their peers can't, which makes them remarkably effective at providing comfort to others. Again, Ruby's commentary carried professional weight, the kind of insight that came from training in child psychology or social work. Alexander decided to push a little harder for information about her background. "You seem to know a lot about childhood development for someone in the restaurant business," he said, keeping his tone casual but direct. Ruby's pause lasted several seconds too long. When she finally responded, her words felt carefully chosen. "I worked with children before opening this place. Different context, same basic principles. Every child needs to feel safe, valued, and capable of contributing something meaningful to the world around them." The answer revealed nothing specific while suggesting extensive, relevant experience. Alexander recognized another evasion technique from business negotiations, acknowledging the question without actually answering it. Ruby Williams was definitely hiding something significant about her professional background. The question was whether her secrecy represented something dangerous or simply something painful she preferred not to discuss. Over the following weeks, Alexander and Isabella established a daily routine centered around their café visits. Isabella's progress was incremental but undeniable. Longer periods of engagement with other customers, more complex tasks like helping Ruby prepare simple foods, even attempts at non-verbal communication through gestures and facial expressions. She still didn't speak, but her silence had changed quality from withdrawn and fearful to contemplative and purposeful. Ruby provided structure and support while allowing Isabella to develop at her own pace, never pushing for specific outcomes or dramatic breakthroughs. Alexander found himself looking forward to these café visits almost as much as Isabella did. Ruby's establishment had become their daily sanctuary, a place where Isabella could practice being herself without judgment or pressure. Alexander also enjoyed watching Ruby work with her diverse clientele, observing her intuitive understanding of different needs and her ability to provide exactly the right kind of support for each individual. She was gifted at reading people, at knowing when to offer help, and when to step back, when to engage, and when to simply be present. These were skills that went far beyond restaurant management or casual people-person abilities. But Ruby's deflections about her background were becoming increasingly obvious, and Alexander's corporate instincts were demanding answers. During quiet moments when Isabella was occupied with other customers, he'd tried various approaches to learn more about Ruby's qualifications and experience. Direct questions were met with subject changes. Casual inquiries about her previous work received vague responses about helping people in unspecified contexts. Even compliments about her obvious expertise with children and adults with special needs were deflected with modest claims about just paying attention to what people need. Ruby Williams was either naturally secretive or professionally trained to avoid revealing personal information. The breakthrough came during Isabella's 4th week of café visits. Alexander arrived to find Ruby kneeling beside a young boy who was having what appeared to be a seizure, his small body rigid and trembling while his mother panicked nearby. Ruby's response was immediate and unmistakably professional. She checked the child's airway, positioned his head to prevent injury, timed the episode on her watch, and spoke in calm medical terminology to the mother about what was happening and what to expect. When the seizure ended, Ruby performed a quick neurological assessment, checking the boy's pupils and reflexes with practiced efficiency. This wasn't first aid training or general emergency response. This was specific medical expertise applied with clinical precision. "Call Dr. Sarah Martinez at Seattle Children's Hospital," Ruby said quietly to the child's mother, helping the boy into a comfortable position while monitoring his vital signs. "Tell her Dr. Williams referred you. She'll know what to do." Alexander felt the world shift slightly around him. Dr. Williams. Not Ruby the cafe owner, but Dr. Ruby Williams with hospital connections and pediatric medical knowledge. The woman who'd been feeding his daughter soup and cookies for a month was actually a physician who'd been concealing her qualifications for reasons Alexander couldn't begin to fathom. Ruby looked up and caught Alexander's stare, reading the recognition and confusion in his expression. Her face went pale as she realized what she'd just revealed. The boy's mother was occupied with gathering her things and preparing to leave for the hospital, unaware of the drama unfolding nearby. Isabella continued coloring at her table, oblivious to the adult revelations that were reshaping everything Alexander thought he knew about their situation. Ruby stood slowly, her hands shaking slightly as she processed the implications of her slip. She'd been practicing medicine without his knowledge or consent, treating his daughter while pretending to be something she wasn't. "We need to talk," Alexander said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled anger of someone trying not to explode in public. Ruby nodded, looking around the cafe at her other customers, calculating responsibilities and priorities. "After closing," she said, "Isabella can play in the back room while we discuss this properly. You deserve explanations, and I owe you honesty about why I've been hiding my credentials." The admission hung between them like a challenge, acknowledging deception while promising revelation. Alexander felt betrayed and grateful simultaneously. Betrayed by the lies, grateful for the results those lies had enabled. The afternoon passed in tense normalcy. Isabella continued her routine interactions with other customers, unaware that the foundation of her healing environment was built on deception. Ruby served meals and provided her usual compassionate attention to various clientele. But Alexander could see the strain in her movements, the way she kept glancing in his direction with apprehension and guilt. Whatever her reasons for hiding her medical background, she clearly understood the ethical and legal problems her secrecy had created. Alexander spent the time trying to control his anger and organize his questions. By the time Ruby locked the front door and flipped the sign to "closed," he had a mental list of demands for information that would determine whether Isabella ever returned to this place. "My name is Dr. Ruby Elizabeth Williams," she began, settling into the chair across from Alexander, while Isabella played with building blocks in the cafe's back room. "I'm a licensed pediatric neuropsychologist. I was Isabella's treating physician for the first 6 months after the accident." Alexander felt like he'd been punched. Isabella's original doctor. The one who'd eventually referred them to other specialists when she couldn't achieve breakthrough results. The one Alexander had blamed, at least partially, for failing to reach his daughter during those crucial early months when intervention might have been most effective. Ruby had been there from the beginning, had witnessed Isabella's immediate trauma response, had struggled with her silence when it first began. "I took a leave of absence 2 years ago because I couldn't help her," Ruby continued, her professional composure cracking slightly. "Every therapeutic approach I tried failed to reach her. Traditional play therapy, art therapy, music therapy, pharmaceutical interventions, nothing worked. Isabella retreated deeper into silence with each failed attempt. I started questioning my competence, my training, my entire career choice." Her voice carried the weight of professional failure, the devastating experience of being unable to help a child who desperately needed healing. Alexander recognized the tone from his own darkest moments, the sound of someone who discovered the limits of their abilities and found those limits inadequate. "So you opened a cafe?" Alexander said, trying to understand the logic behind such a drastic career change. Ruby nodded, her fingers tracing patterns on the table surface in a gesture that reminded him painfully of Isabella's repetitive behaviors. "I needed space to think, to figure out whether I wanted to continue practicing medicine. The cafe was supposed to be temporary, a way to work with people without the pressure of clinical expectations. I never intended to practice psychology here. I certainly never expected Isabella to walk through my door." She looked toward the back room, where Isabella was contentedly building tower with wooden blocks, creating structures that would have been impossible for her to manage during her first months of trauma recovery. "But when you saw her, you couldn't resist treating her unofficially," Alexander said, his anger mixing with reluctant understanding. Ruby's medical oath would have made it difficult to ignore a child she'd previously treated, especially one who wasn't making progress with other providers. "When I saw Isabella in your car that day, I knew I had to try something different. Clinical settings had failed her completely. Formal therapeutic relationships had only increased her withdrawal. She needed what she'd never had, the chance to heal naturally, without pressure or evaluation, in an environment that felt like normal life instead of medical intervention." Ruby's explanation made sense even as it highlighted the massive ethical violations involved in her approach. Alexander struggled with conflicting emotions: gratitude for Isabella's progress, fury about the deception, confusion about what should happen next. "You've been practicing medicine on my daughter without my knowledge or consent. Do you understand the legal implications of what you've done?" Ruby met his gaze directly, accepting his anger without defensiveness. "Yes, I understand completely. I've violated multiple professional standards and legal requirements. I'm prepared to face whatever consequences result from my actions." Her willingness to accept responsibility was both admirable and insufficient. The damage to trust had been done, even if the results had been positive. "The consequences," Alexander said, standing to pace the small space between tables, "include the fact that my daughter has been making genuine progress with someone who abandoned her case 2 years ago. Someone who's been lying about their identity and qualifications while treating her informally." His voice rose slightly before he controlled it, remembering Isabella's presence in the next room. Ruby remained seated, a posture accepting his fury while maintaining her own dignity. "You have every right to be angry, but you can't deny that Isabella is better now than she was 6 weeks ago. She's eating, engaging socially, showing empathy and fine motor control that were completely absent when you first brought her here." The truth of Ruby's statement was undeniable. Isabella had made more progress in 6 weeks of cafe visits than in 2 years of formal therapy with multiple specialists. But progress achieved through deception felt contaminated, tainted by the lies that had enabled it. Why? Alexander asked, his anger giving way to exhausted confusion. Why take such enormous risks? Why hide your identity instead of just contacting me directly and offering to resume treatment? Ruby's expression softened slightly, moving from professional defensiveness to personal vulnerability. Because formal treatment had failed completely. Isabella associated clinical settings with pressure to perform, with being evaluated and found inadequate. She needed something that felt like ordinary life, helping other people, contributing to a community, being useful rather than being fixed. Isabella appeared in the doorway between the main cafe and the back room, holding a small wooden tower she'd constructed from blocks. She looked between her father and Ruby with the perceptive concern children develop when they sense adult tension they don't understand. "Dr. Ruby," she said quietly, using speech that still felt miraculous to Alexander's ears. "Are you and Daddy arguing?" Both adults stared at her in momentary shock. She'd not only spoken, but used Ruby's professional title, suggesting she retained more awareness of their early therapeutic relationship than anyone had realized. Ruby knelt to Isabella's eye level, her medical training and personal affection combining in her response. "We're having a grown-up conversation about how to help you best," Ruby said gently. "Sometimes adults need to talk about complicated things to make sure they're making good choices." Isabella nodded with 7-year-old seriousness, then looked at her father. "I like coming here, Daddy. Dr. Ruby helps me remember how to be helpful." The simple statement contained more insight than months of therapy reports. Isabella understood, at some level, that Ruby's cafe had given her back her sense of purpose and competence. She wasn't just being treated here. She was contributing, making a difference in other people's lives, rediscovering her own value and capabilities. Alexander looked at his daughter's trusting face, then at Ruby's expression of professional hope and personal guilt. The situation was ethically complicated beyond simple resolution. Ruby had violated numerous professional standards while achieving results that properly credentialed specialists had failed to produce. Isabella had made genuine progress in an environment built on deception, but that progress was real, regardless of the circumstances that had enabled it. "What happens now?" Alexander asked, his anger replaced by practical concern for Isabella's continued healing and Ruby's professional future. "That depends on what you decide," Ruby said honestly. "I can resume treating Isabella officially, with proper documentation and ethical oversight. The cafe can remain part of her therapeutic environment, but within appropriate clinical boundaries. Or you can report my violations to the State Medical Board and find another provider for Isabella's continued treatment." She paused, looking at Isabella with obvious affection and professional assessment. "What I can tell you is that Isabella is ready for the next phase of her recovery. She's developed enough confidence and social skills to handle more traditional therapeutic approaches, if that's what you prefer." Isabella listened to this conversation with remarkable attention for a 7-year-old, her expression suggesting she understood more than the adults might expect. When both her father and Ruby looked at her, she spoke with characteristic directness. "I want to keep helping Mr. Peterson eat his lunch. And I want to make cookies for the sad kids who come here. Dr. Ruby teaches me how to take care of people like Mommy used to take care of me." "Ties," The statement hit Alexander like a revelation. Isabella wasn't just healing from trauma, she was learning to transform her experience of loss into purposeful caring for others. Ruby's informal approach had allowed Isabella to develop coping mechanisms and life skills that traditional therapy might never have addressed. Alexander made his decision with the same intuition that had guided him through successful business ventures and personal crises. We continue, but officially this time. I want proper documentation, regular progress reports, and complete transparency about your methods and objectives. He looked at Ruby directly, testing her commitment to honest professional relationship. And I want to understand exactly how your approach differs from conventional therapy, why it worked when other treatments failed. Ruby nodded, relief and professional excitement visible in her expression. I'd be honored to continue working with Isabella under proper clinical guidelines, and I think you'll find that the most effective healing often happens when people feel useful rather than just treated. 6 months later, Alexander stood in the same spot where he'd first watched Ruby feed his daughter. But now Isabella moved through the cafe like she belonged there, helping other children with their meals, chatting with regular customers, and assisting Ruby with daily operations that had become therapeutic activities disguised as normal work. Isabella had returned to school part-time and was making friends with the determined optimism of someone who'd learned that relationships required courage but were worth the risk. Her speech had returned gradually, along with laughter, curiosity, and the 1,000 small joys of childhood that trauma had temporarily stolen but not permanently destroyed. Ruby had resumed her practice formally, converting the cafe's back room into a proper therapy office, while maintaining the restaurant's warm, welcoming atmosphere that had made healing possible for Isabella and dozens of other children whose families had sought Ruby's unconventional but effective services. Her approach remained unique in the mental health field, combining clinical expertise with nurturing care, using everyday activities as therapeutic tools, and allowing children to heal within supportive community relationships rather than isolated clinical interactions. The State Medical Board had reviewed her case and ultimately endorsed her methods, recognizing that innovation sometimes required stepping outside traditional professional boundaries. Alexander had learned to distinguish between healing and curing, between professional competence and human connection, between expensive solutions and effective ones. Isabella would always carry the emotional scar of losing her mother too young, but she'd learned to live with that grief rather than be consumed by it. Ruby had taught them both that recovery wasn't about returning to some previous state of wholeness, but about integrating loss into a life that could still contain joy, purpose, and deep connection with others who understood the complexity of surviving tragedy while remaining open to love. The ceramic bowl with hand-painted hearts still sat on Isabella's favorite table, a reminder of the first meal that had started their journey toward healing. Isabella used it now to feed other children who came to the cafe carrying their own trauma and silence, passing along the patient care Ruby had shown her during those crucial early weeks. She'd learned Ruby's gentle rhythm, her encouraging words, her ability to offer nourishment without pressure or expectation. The greatest gift Ruby had given Isabella wasn't just her voice back. It was the understanding that healing happens when broken people help other broken people discover they're not alone in their pain. Alexander watched his daughter help a new arrival, a girl about Isabella's age who hadn't spoken since her parents' divorce 6 months earlier. Isabella offered her soup with the same ceremonial patience Ruby had demonstrated, creating an unbroken circle of care that extended far beyond individual therapy sessions or clinical protocols. This was healing in its purest form, people who'd survived their own darkness helping others navigate similar struggles, proving that the most profound transformations often happen not in hospitals or therapy offices, but in quiet spaces where people feed each other with attention, patience, and the radical belief that everyone deserves to be nourished back to wholeness, one careful spoonful at a time.